the Enlightenment and beyond that, then our founding fathers went back to the Greeks and eventually to the Romans as well, nations of the Republic, in order to try to establish a new government in the earth that was different from the monarchies. And I mean, to think about how unusual this was, just think about the emperors we've talked about, the surrounding peoples. The Greeks come up with this idea of something like democracy and other stuff. And meanwhile, the Persians have this absolute monarch who all he has to do is say he dies and he dies. Nebuchadnezzar and the other guys from Mesopotamia were no better. That's the kind of government most people in the ancient world were used to. And the Greeks come along with these ideas that are much more appealing to us anyway, and the same with the law. So Hellenistic culture is developed from a synthesis of Greek ideas with the customs and traditions of the areas into which these ideas were introduced. So I gave the example of Egypt. That's why they don't just call it Greek culture. Hellenistic culture takes into consideration what happened after the Greek culture under Alexander, and eventually his generals began to mix in, synthesize with the cultures that it had conquered. And so you get, in a place like Egypt, then a Hellenistic culture that's not, it's not just Greek, because it's got a lot of Egyptian stuff in it too. But amazing in its variety and its depth and its nuance, because it was bringing in cultural elements from all kinds of other places. So Alexander introduced Greek as the principal language in conquered regions and founded a number of new cities along Greek lines, Alexandria being the most prominent one, but there were others as well. And even in the era that would have been known as Palestine, he and his successors established a number of Greek cities. The 10 cities called the Decapolis, you've probably heard of that in scripture readings, up in the northern part of the area. That's Greek. That's a Greek word for 10 cities. Why? Because they were Greek cities, basically. They were built along Greek lines. If you ever go to the Holy Land, you do a pilgrimage, and you include some of those towns and some others, you'll see the great Greek amphitheaters, you'll see Greek temples, you'll see Greek architecture everywhere in the ruins, because they were established during this period. So, but Alexander was convinced by Aristotle and other things he'd seen that Greek culture was the pinnacle of culture. And so everybody ought to be Greek in some way, all the people he conquered. I may have mentioned before, our word barbarian, did I talk about where that word comes from? It's from the Greek barbaros. And the Greeks thought of everybody who didn't speak Greek as uncivilized. And to put it in a very kind of vivid way, they said if you didn't speak Greek, all you did was go bada 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 bada. It's kind of like they'll say yada yada yada, but they say bada 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 bada. And so, I'm not making this up, okay? And so that's where the word bada bados comes from. The guy who goes bada 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 bada, because he doesn't know how to speak Greek. How disgusting, you know? So that gives you an idea of their attitudes toward people who didn't speak Greek. Theirs was the greatest culture of all, right? And so all these Babadians around were the folks who had to learn Greek. And in fact, after the conquest, he did so well at establishing Greek that it did become the common language of that part of the world for a long, long time. Of course, later on when the Romans come, Latin becomes imported throughout the West. And even after the Romans conquered this part, there's some Latin there. But even, as we'll see in the time of Jesus, you still have Greek as really the common language. And that's why the New Testament is written in Greek. Right. All right. So he introduces this language, founds a number of new cities. Sometimes it goes better than others. But the Diadochi, two of his generals established themselves in the principal areas of the former Persian Empire. Ptolemy was the one who ruled Egypt. So that name, even that name Ptolemaios is Greek, and Syria and Palestine. So if you look at the map that you've got there, that was also up there a while ago, Ptolemy's portion of it, and these pages are kind of staple funny. I was doing it the other day, and if I had Sherry do it, she would have gotten it right, but I got it kind of mixed up. So anyway, if you look at the part, Alexander the Great's empire, let's see, where's the second map? The division of Alexander's empire, the back of the front page there. You see then the Ptolemaic area that includes Egypt, and that went all the way down, or I guess topologically up the Nile River, there, and included all that, Palestine, that kind of thing. And then all that's the kind of orange there, and then all the rest there is the green of the other major portion. So Egypt, Syria, Palestine, Seleucus gained control over Mesopotamia and Persia and Asia Minor. Here's some of those ruins I was talking about. I think these may actually be in Palestine, what's now Israel. You can see, obviously, Greek influence. It's got the Greek Corinthian columns. That's not Jewish architecture, not classic Jewish architecture. So their successors then introduced many elements of Greek culture to these regions, such as the gymnasium, the theater, and the worship of Greek gods. So who's going to have trouble with that? The Jewish people are going to have trouble with that. Not just with the worship of Greek gods, which are bad enough, but you're going to have the Greeks want to force them to become more cosmopolitan, to become world citizens. You heard that before? To give up their particular patrimony, to cultural patrimony. And you are so exclusive. You worship one God. Come on, look, we've got a whole shelf full of gods. All you have to do is put another one on the statue on the shelf with all the rest of them, right? Come on. You're so exclusive. You're so intolerant. You only worship one God. You actually had the early Christians were accused by the pagans of being atheists. That was the charge that was often brought about them, not because they didn't believe in God, but because they didn't believe in the gods. You have this great scene from Polycarp, one of the earliest martyrdom accounts we have, other than St. Stephen in the book of Acts, is St. Polycarp, who's old man. He's in his 80s, late 80s by then. He's bishop. He's brought before the rulers, and he refuses to renounce Christ. And they thought if they could get him to renounce, the rest of the Christians would fall in line because he was the bishop. He has this great line where he says something like, 86 years I have served my Lord Jesus, and he has never betrayed me. You think I'm going to betray him now? It's a great line. And they mistreat him. They bring him into the theater there, and all the pagans are bloodthirsty, looking for. They want to see the people get eaten by lions and all that kind of stuff. And so he's standing there, very nobly, and the emperor's has been kind of pronounced sentence, and all the people are hollering at him and cursing him, and finally the emperor says, "Just say it. Away with the atheists," meaning the Christians. Just say, "Away with the atheists, and we'll save you." And he looks out over the pagan, screaming, barbaric crowd and puts his hand out like this and says, "Away with the atheists." And then they get really mad. And of course he does. But anyway, so they were often charged with atheism because they said, "No, we're not going to worship all those gods. They're false gods." They're what? That's my mother taught me how to worship that God. What are you saying? So, Mary, did you?
Yeah, I'm reading a book right now that's really kind of scary. That is called Being Christian in a Post-Christian Era by Bishop Shipwood. He talks about that exact same thing that you're talking about, that the Greeks move in and they're trying to level the playing field and, you need to honor our gods and you need to do this and you need to do that. And that's exactly what our culture is doing right now in the United States, with getting everybody to get on the same level playing field, and the puppet strings are being pulled by the powers that be.
That's why I mentioned it. It's something for us to think about. So they come in, and is Deacon still here? Is Deacon here? He came in. Oh, he must have just come in for the donuts. He came in and he said something like, "So are we going to encourage everybody to imitate the Greeks and exercise naked?" That's one of the things that conservative traditional Jews hated about Greek culture. Wherever they come in, they would build gymnasia, and they did their exercise and their athletic competitions naked. And to Jews, that was shameful. And so you can imagine when they build the gymnasium in Jerusalem, what the Jews are thinking of that, alongside all the Greek guys saying, "Oh, just come on, Zeus, Hera, these other guys, Apollo, come on, Aphrodite, you really like her?" And they come in with that stuff. And then they come in with the theater, and any of you who've studied ancient Greek theater know there's some great stuff and there's some really lewd stuff. They would bring that kind of thing in. So this is, a lot of great things in Greek culture, but they're going to bring everything Greek in. And the Jews are not like it. Most of them, that's part of what happens. The problem is you have the sympathizers. It happens every time. So this Hellenized culture, blending Greek and other traditions, remained dominant throughout this part of the world until the arrival of Islam in the 7th century. Not all the multiple god stuff and the lewd stuff, because Christianity did transform that in the first centuries of the Christian church. But you still had Hellenistic culture. You still had Hellenistic architecture, law. The language was still Greek for those first few centuries until the Muslim conquest, when Arabic became the shared culture and other things became dominant. So these divisions we talked about, here's the map. This is about the year 270 BC. So you got Ptolemy, Seleucus there. Can't remember who's the other guy. I can't even read it now. The other two aren't too important, so I can't remember their names. But it just gives you an idea of how the empires are getting divided up. And so let's focus now on Palestine, the Greek period in Palestine, about the year 323 to 167 BC. At the beginning, under the Ptolemies, remember the original division, the folks who were the Ptolemies included, along with Egypt, they got Palestine. So they did pretty well under those folks. They had considerable self-rule. They were allowed to practice their religion freely. They did have to pay taxes. That's always how it goes. Death and taxes, right? Since ever shall it be, and ever has it been. So during this time, then, Hellenization was a choice rather than an imposition. So people who, Jews who would see the Greeks come in and say, "Oh, I kind of like that language." And the Greek language is a phenomenal thing. I studied the classical Greek first, and then Koine Greek, which was the later, more simplified, universalized form of Greek that the New Testament's in. And it's beautiful. It's precise. You can see why the philosophers would have blossomed under there, because they're really good at making distinctions and categories in their in the way they speak. The Greek participles are horrendous. Participle is a verb that's being used as an adjective or a noun, and a verb, at least in English, gets conjugated, right? And so you have all these different forms of conjugation, and then nouns and adjectives don't really get declined in English as they do in German and certain other languages, but in Greek they do. So a participle gets declined and conjugated. So you can take one participle, I remember on my Greek text, and a 2-page spread is filled with all the different inflections of a Greek participle. Both decline and, because the declensions all overlap the conjugations, and you can have it decline. So anyway, and that was just one participle, and it was a regular one. You had several ways of doing it, and then you had the irregular ones that didn't follow the rules. And sometimes this one looked just like this one, and there's no reason why they're alike. But nevertheless, if you learned it, very precise language, very, very beautiful. For that reason, for instance, in Greek, you could just about mix all the words up and put them back down, and they still made sense, because it wasn't word order that determined the meaning. It was the inflection of the end. So, for instance, we would say, the dog bit the man. But if you swap it around and say the man bit the dog, it means something totally different. But in Greek, all you had to do was look at the end of the word, and you knew which one did it and which one it was done to. So anyway, and I think I mentioned that because I think there's a very good reason, one of the good reasons for the Lord to send our Lord, a few centuries later when Greek had become common in so much of the world, is that the Greek language was a wonderful vehicle for the New Testament. Even the Greek language that had been a little bit kind of universalized, and so they dropped out some things. All right, when we say you have singular and plural, okay, that's called number in in grammar. So can you think of another number besides singular and plural? You would think that covers everything, right? In Greek, there's another number, the dual. So anything that comes in pairs has its own form. So you would have one ox, 3 oxen, but then a certain kind of word for 2 oxen, or 2 eyes, or 2 hands, or that kind of thing. That dropped out in the later version. But anyway, I hope I'm not getting too distracted this morning. But it's a fascinating culture, and it's important for us to learn that the culture that's being set up in this period is the culture into which our Lord is born, and the culture that provides the context for the early church, and for centuries after that, the early church councils. It's the Greek language and this Greek precision in the language that helps the church to develop her theology and to make it specific. Great example. Been a lot of memes on Facebook around St. Nicholas Day that I've been playing with too. The difference between homoousios and homoousios. There was an entire theological battle in the church fought over whether Jesus was homoousios with the Father, which means the same substance as the Father. We use the word now from the Latin consubstantial. Or whether he was homoousios. Just a little iota, the smallest Greek letter. Add a little iota. Homoousios means not the same, but a similar substance to the Father. So in other words, there's a whole universe of meaning in that little iota, because that means he's not fully God. He's not of the same substance as the Father. He's just kind of like the Father. And that was the Arian heresy. And then folks after it trying to make it, to find a compromise. Homoousios meant basically Jesus isn't fully God. He's something less. So the whole world, you have, who is that? I can't remember, one of the secular scholars, who probably was an atheist himself, who used to mock the Christian church, that they had this big theological battle over a little iota. How ridiculous. But there's a world of meaning in that little iota. And why would the Greek be like this? Because Greek is so precise. That little iota does make a total difference in category.
Is that why we went back to consubstantial? My son just thought that was ridiculous.
Consubstantial is the technical theological term in English that I think it's better for us to use. Rather than say, well, I don't know what it means, we just say, well, I'll learn what it means. But it means exactly the same substance as the Father, the same reality as the Father, underlying reality, not just similar, not just a little like. So I have a meme on my Facebook page where it says, you ever wondered how ho 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 ever became associated with St. Nick? And it has an icon of St. Nicholas that he says, ho ho homoousios. But you have to be a theological nerd to get it. Yeah.
Given the philosophical preciseness of the Greek language, why did the church choose Latin as its official language?
Because eventually, especially in the West, that's where that's where the theology was being done. During the early centuries, where you had the Greeks and Greek-speaking and Latin-speaking East and West were growing apart from each other. That was part of the problem too, like with trying to understand the nature of Christ, that they were using different theological languages, and a word that would mean in Latin to persons seemed in Greek to sound more like two roles, or like from a play, and that was not the same thing at all. So you get all this argument over it. But in the early days, that was part of the problem, that they were using Greek in the East, Latin in the West. But especially once you have the division, first of all, there wasn't as much development of theology in the East as there was in the West, or it went along different lines, kind of mystical or practical. But once you do have the split, then of course the East is going to go its own way with Greek, the West is going to go its own way with Latin. And our tradition, of course, is Latin, unless we're in one of the Eastern Catholic rites. Good question. Yeah.
Dr. Paul, if God chose Greek or to implement Jesus during Greek language time, which is precise, are we then to understand that the translation is much more accurate in our New Testament than what other people would contradict, like atheists?
The translation into English?
Right. If our the Bible is much more accurate than we would assume it normally would be because of the years that's gone by.
Yeah, I think we did actually have a session way back when about the text and the translations and that kind of thing, why they're so reliable in the New Testament. And you can list out all the things that a secular historian says these are the standards for accurate text, or for text to be at least likely to be historically true rather than others. And when you put those next to the New Testament documents meet all the qualifications 100 times better than any of the secular ones. And so Greek, again, if some of the New Testament might have been written in Hebrew, or there's a good chance we have an ancient tradition that Matthew was first written in Hebrew, or it probably would have been Aramaic, which is very similar to Hebrew. It's what the Jewish people were speaking in Palestine at the time. And so we have that ancient tradition, but we don't have a copy of it like that. We only have it in Greek. And so aside from that, there's a good reason why the New Testament documents were not written in Hebrew or Aramaic, because only a small group of people there spoke it. Even the Jews in Alexandria, Egypt, didn't speak Hebrew. They may have known a little bit from the liturgy that they used, just like we know a little bit of Latin. But they spoke Greek, and most of them grew up speaking Greek. That's why we have the Septuagint translation of the Old Testament. They had to translate the Hebrew text in Aramaic into Greek so that the people could read it, because they couldn't read the Hebrew. So all this is to say that so the Lord has our Lord born in the part of the world that is speaking Greek, and it's a common language by then. Koine, that's what it means, Koine Greek, common Greek. So that if you spoke Greek, you could read this text, and not only that, if you could be Jewish and go to Syria, where the Syrians are, and they spoke Greek too, or you could go down to Egypt, and the Egyptians spoke Greek. And just like English is often used as a commercial language today, same kind of thing. Greek was the language for that, and so the gospel spread much more quickly. And even in the West, you had a lot of people who knew some Greek just because it was so important in the East. But eventually, as the center of gravity in certain ways moved with Rome to the West, then that's why as early as the 300s, the 4th century, Pope Damasus asked St. Jerome to translate the Bible into Latin and gave us what we call the Vulgate, because it was important then to have it in Latin because so many people spoke that as their first language. Is that all making sense? It's a lot of information that dealt with. Okay, so during this time it was a choice rather than imposition. You had many people who were very attracted to Greek culture, and certain items you can understand why. The architecture was beautiful, very well done, structurally great. The language, as I said, was very precise, very beautiful, very given especially to scholarly work. You eventually have Jewish writers like Josephus, who was an historian, and he chose to write in Greek rather than Hebrew. First of all, so more people could read it, but because the Greek was so good for writing history. You had some people who were kind of even found it appealing other parts of the Greek tradition, the Greek culture. So it was most popular among Jews of the new generation after the conquest, when they first get introduced to it. The other things, you see it all the time in history when one people gets conquered by another, that often because the other guys, the conquerors, have the upper hand culturally, politically, their culture looks even more attractive than it might otherwise, because that's the way to kind of move up for yourself. That's, if you can become more like the guys that just conquered you, it puts you in a better position socially, politically. So all that kind of stuff was probably going on too in that new generation. But also with Jews who had contacts with Greeks outside of Palestine, such as the ones I was talking about in Antioch and Alexandria and Damascus. So the kind of cosmopolitan Jews of the day found very attractive this Greek culture. I mentioned the Septuagint again. It was during this period that the Jewish community in Alexandria produced the Septuagint, meaning the 70 scholars, the first translation of the Old Testament scriptures into Greek. That's the Hebrew, that's the Greek. But then the major turn in politics. Palestine was a point of contention for the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, the folks who followed Seleucus. Keep in mind, I mean, it's still the case that that piece of land there, the eastern end of the Mediterranean, has always been a place of contention. Geographically, it's the bridge between Africa and the Near East, the rest of the Near East, so Asia Minor and parts further on, like Mesopotamia. And because you had Egypt on and off becoming such a powerful nation, and then all the powerful nations out of Mesopotamia, and then actually third group, the Hittites and others up in what's now Asia Minor, became very powerful at different times. So this becomes the land that gets disputed. And so even after Alexander's empire gets divided up, you have the Ptolemies down here in Egypt and getting all that part, and they're trying to consolidate their power, but then the Seleucids over here with the, mostly in Asia, they're saying, we kind of like that thing that Ptolemy has there. Maybe we ought to.
I think that, you probably don't understand that because, nowadays you can fly in a plane or sail in a ship even. but all of these civilizations were land-based.
Yeah.
So if you didn't have the access to the land, you weren't going anywhere, so it was always that power struggle.
Yes, and you often had mountains that would, so that there would be one major route in a valley through this area, and he's the crazy. So even then, in the early years of his reign, then conditions worsened considerably for the Jews. He had a very different notion. Yes,
Is that what the word epiphany means? Like splendid? Like, because when I think of the epiphany, I think of kind of like the revealing of Jesus. Is that related?
yeah, so epiphany literally means kind of a manifestation, epiphanos, to if something is like that, it's usually shining, it's splendid, yeah. So things get worse. After various kinds of political intrigue developed involving the high priest's family and their rivals, the civil unrest was interpreted by Antiochus as revolt. So there's so much going on. It's a very complicated period of Jewish history, but they still had kind of self-rule, but then they started fighting among themselves. We'll talk more about probably next week about who was fighting with whom and why, because it's during this period that you get the Sadducees and the Pharisees have their beginnings, who figure so prominently in the Gospels and in the life of Jesus. So the civil unrest, and Antiochus, wherever he was, I don't remember where he had his capital, he says, oh, looks like a revolt to me. We can send in soldiers. And so, Antiochus versus the Jews. There's crazy. He sent in troops that killed many of the Jewish people. He looted the temple treasury. He left a military garrison in Jerusalem. Very heavy-handed. Then, to make his point, who's in charge? He knew that the Jewish people considered pigs to be unclean. So he sacrificed a pig, had it done on the altar in the temple to desecrate the altar, and because in Jewish thinking it would all be unclean after that. Down really heavy. He knows the place he knows that for the Jewish people, whatever resistance there will be to this globalization that he wants will come by way of their religion, because it's their religion that gives them their distinctiveness. They're fine with Greek architecture, and they're fine with a lot of the language and that kind of stuff. But the place of resistance will be connected to their faith, because it's their one God, and the refusal to eat pork, and their abhorrence of the naked wrestling and the obscene stuff. So that's where he comes at it. And then he begins a brutal anti-Jewish campaign to force them to renounce their old religion and tradition. It is this globalization, the notion, this idea that we have to impose a unified culture to make one people out of them, one people out of me. And so this is where things get rough.
Did the Jewish people have any type of a formal military to combat that, or was it just
start a military revolt and are successful for a while? So it's so how many of you know Robert George or know of? And he was talking about the difference between an authoritarian and a totalitarian. He said an authoritarian will forbid you to speak what you believe. A totalitarian will command you to speak what you don't believe. Big difference. And he sees that happening on the left today, where people more and more saying, not only I'm going to tell you can't speak openly what you believe, but you're going to have to publicly use my language and say what I want. And we could go into that, but there was a particular case recently of a school teacher being fired. We'll go into it. But anyway, this is the kind of thing that he's doing. Not only does he, basically will have to eat pork, you will have to burn incense to the gods, you will have to do all these things that are contrary to what you believe. And it was at that point that things began to break, because they couldn't do it, at least a lot of them. A lot of folks were still going along with it, unfortunately. But there were some who revolted. So, I don't know, do we have other questions? Yes,
It
Catherine?
really doesn't relate to that.
It's okay.
But it's been weighing on my mind. We have the Roman Catholic Church, and then we have other parts of the Catholic Church that are united with Rome. Are they not considered Roman Catholic Church because at one time they were actually split from the Catholic Church and then came back in union with them?
Actually began as a derogatory Protestant word to use for Catholics, a slight.
But we
Because
understand it as
we do, but for don't prefer it. I'd rather just say Catholic.
Requires the president must be a Maronite.
I thought that they went back and forth between Maronite and
It may have changed, but
Yeah.
I
And
read
Muslim,
that
okay.
part not too long ago.
Okay, I just
So-
wondered that,
So with the division, you had certain parts kind of, because the Eastern Church itself was kind of divided ethnically, you know, the Russian Orthodox, the Greek Orthodox, the Antiochian, Antioch Orthodox, that kind of thing. But after a period of time, with the exception of the Maronites, who, at least that's their insistence, that they never actually separated, but were separated, isolated from the West because of political conditions, that they came to the point as a whole, and especially the leadership, of saying we need to be united with Rome, and they came back. For that reason, they were for a long time called the Uniate churches, because they united again. But that was kind of a term among the Easterners toward them, so we don't really use that. So I think it's more accurate to speak of the Catholic Church, which includes everybody in union with Rome, and then to speak of the Western Rite, which is that derived from Latin, based on Latin, and then the Eastern Rites. So the Maronite, Melkite, Greek, Catholic, all those, Russian.
Thank you.
I have something that Kathy just gave me that I think is so pertinent for us now. They always say before you can have cultural change, word change.
Okay. Cyril, talking to his mom, says, "Our class is putting on a show." Now, assure me this isn't going to be embarrassing.
No.
Okay. I'm reading something blind to publicly. At least we're not recording this word. Okay. "Our class is putting on a show." Mom says, "Fun." He said, "Here's the info," and he hands it to her. Then she reads it aloud. "Come one, come all to the vaguely festive, non-denominational, winter-ish gathering." And the little boy says, "You can get in for half price if you're easily offended." Yes, let's not do anything. It's what theological scholars call the scandal of the particular. And what they mean by that is that one of the scandals of the Christian faith has always been that when God became human, he took on a particular form. He was not just a human, he was a man. He was not just a human, he was a Jew. He lived in a particular time and place. And that folks who really are always pressing the universalist thing want to say, "Oh no, that can't be, he can't be God because he's so particular. Everything's got to be universal and abstract." But the Christian faith is that no, God had to choose a particular time and place and gender and everything. Blessed in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be.
I was